The end of the wars of the Diadochi was now just over the horizon. The end of the 4th century had seen some truly titanic clashes between the successors of Alexander the Great, clashes that would culminate in a major battle that would decide the fate of entire kingdoms. Antigonus, Cassander, Lysimachos, Ptolemy and Seleukos were rattling their sabres, each willing to do whatever it took to ensure their empires lasted for centuries to come. The Titanomachy had lasted for decades and was ready to culminate in the Battle of Ipsus. But before that, much politicking and grandstanding will take place, with a surprise return of Seleukos with weapons acquired from India. Antigonos will face his nemesis once more, and the end of the century will usher in the dawn of a new era and a new geopolitical configuration in Western Eurasia. Will the Antigonids reunify the empire under their auspices? Will another dynasty achieve this? Or will the empire remain forever fractured? Welcome to the 8th installment of our series on the Wars of Alexander's successors, covering the Battle of Ipsus and its aftermath. This video is sponsored by our YouTube members and patrons, who get 2 exclusive videos weekly, not available anywhere else, for their kind support of our channel. You can join their ranks to watch more than 160 videos, including our series on the Pacific War, Punic Wars, Persian Wars, Spanish War of Succession, Russo-Japanese War, North African Campaign of World War II, History of Prussia, Italian Unification Wars, Risorgimento, Albigensian Crusades, and much more. Click the link in the description or pinned comment to get the exclusive videos, early access to all public videos, our schedule, wallpapers, access to a special Discord server where we're very active, and much more. Thanks for supporting us, we couldn't be doing it without your help. When we last left off, Lysimachos and Cassander had sent their envoys to Ptolemy and Seleukos. The pharaoh of Egypt accepted these envoys, but Seleukos was not in his capital of Babylon to receive his, for he was off campaigning in the Orient. Seleukos' conquest of the eastern satrapies is little known, but we can surmise that he probably managed to subdue most of Persia, as well as Bactria and Hyrcania. He probably fought a war against Scythian tribes, but the most important of Seleukos' wars was to be fought further east, against a man who would prove to be his equal. That man was the king of Magadha and the founder of the famous Maurya Empire of India, Chandragupta Maurya. Chandragupta had recently overthrown the last king of the kingdom of Nanda, and had accumulated power from the eastern parts of India across the Gangetic Plains and the northwest of the subcontinent. The obscure but possibly titanic Seleucid-Mauryan War lasted from 305 to 303 BCE, and its results are unclear. We know nothing of the campaigns or where they took place, though it is likely the Seleucids crossed the Hindu Kush and were stuck there for the majority of the conflict. No accounts of the battles of this war survive, so anything from Seleukos and Chandragupta fighting in a Greek versus Indian wrestling match, to Megarian, Aristotelian and Platonist philosophers having a mass debate against Buddhists, Jains and Ajivikas are possible. The most likely and disappointing scenario, however, is that the Greeks and Indians merely engaged in multiple bloody and probably indecisive battles. Most historians agree that Seleukos lost this war, resulting in a peace treaty where one of Seleukos' daughters was married to Chandragupta in exchange for the Indian king providing the Macedonian Diadochos with 500 war elephants. Moreover, the Hindu Kush became an unofficial border between the Seleucid and Maurya nations, with the region of Gandhara coming under Mauryan control. Seleukos would later send an ambassador, Megasthenes, to the Mauryan court, and his fragmentary records provide a small insight into Mauryan life and India in general. These 2 titans of antiquity, one ruling Persia and the other India, thus proved to be more than a match for each other. Armed with his new elephants, and having heard of the news from Cassander's envoys, Seleukos went west to organize and fight Antigonos once more. While Seleukos was on the move, Cassander decided to stay in Greece to guard the southern frontiers of Macedon against Demetrios. Cassander's best general, Pripylos, joined forces with Lysimachos in Byzantium, from where the 2 commenced a surprise attack into Antigonid territory in Asia Minor. Antigonos heard of this news and amassed his troops. He departed Antigonia, arriving in Asia Minor in 303 BCE and engaging Lysimachos in a stalking game across the northwest of the region. However, the latter eluded the Antigonid until winter, when both armies stopped to endure the cold weather. In the south and the east, two new events unfolded. In the south, Ptolemy had entered Phoenicia by sea and land and began a little attested siege of the city of Astarte, Sidon. In the east, Seleukos appeared from the lands of Ahura Mazda and, in a lightning bolt march, united with Lysimachos. While Ptolemy retreated after hearing rumours that Lysimachos and Seleukos had been defeated, Antigonos got wind of the arrival of Seleukos and immediately asked Demetrios to come to his aid. The besieger obliged and travelled across the Aegean, powering through the region and recapturing coastal cities on his way to meet his father at Kyllene. Father and son then met and marched forth to face their enemies. After maneuvers that we sadly know little about, the two armies met at Ipsus in Phrygia in 301 BCE. The time had finally come to see who was the greatest general. Before long, the generals entered the battlefield, which was located somewhere around Ipsus. The Antigonids had amassed 70,000 infantry, mainly of the heavy type. Placing them in the centre alongside mercenaries, Antigonos put his son Demetrios on the right wing, alongside 5,000 cavalry and a certain Pyrrhus of Epiros, who later would immortalise himself by invading a fledgling Roman Empire and coining the term Pyrrhic victory through his extremely costly triumphs. The one-eyed general moved to the left flank alongside 5,000 more cavalry, while placing 75 elephants and light infantry in alternating positions in front of the centre. Seleukos and Lysimachos placed their heavy infantry of 64,000 in the centre, combining both Greek and Asian troops from all over the Seleucid realm. 7,500 cavalry were deployed both on the right and left flanks of their army, while Seleukos put some of his elephants at the front. The rest of the elephants were left behind as a reserve force. Interestingly, Seleukos had brought his 23-year-old son, Antiochos, alongside him to fight in the left wing of the Macedonian cavalry. The elephants on both sides released a deafening trumpeting din as they both began to charge forward. The infantry in the centre of both alliances pushed behind them in slow, methodical movements. Demetrios took the initiative on the right wing and charged forward towards the enemy cavalry. It proved to be a quick fight, with Antiochos forced to retreat with Demetrios behind him. Thereafter, both cavalry formations left the battlefield. Meanwhile, the cavalries on the other side of the battlefield had also engaged, but in the centre, the Antigonid infantry had managed to inflict heavy losses on the Seleucid Lysimachian middle. Demetrios continued chasing Antiochos, but eventually turned around to attack Seleukos from behind. However, Seleukos was not to be so easily defeated. He ordered his reserve elephants to move into position, which they did, blocking the path of the besieger. Try as he might, Demetrios could not get around the elephants. Then Seleukos took the light cavalry and ordered them to move around the centre formation and move onto the right flank of the Antigonid infantry, where Antigonos had been exposed after Demetrios' assault on the right. Now the light cavalry moved to fill that gap. They raised their javelins and threw them at the heavy infantry, which soon began to collapse. Pushing through the now chaotic centre, Seleukos moved to the left, where Antigonos was with his cavalry. Despite the difficult situation he was in, Antigonos remained in the field of battle, never retreating and remaining hopeful that his son would return and help him. Thus he perished in the place he'd spent most of his life, on the battlefield, as a field of javelins struck both him and his faithful companions. Antigonos was a truly ambitious man, skilled in the art of war, and managed to survive facing overwhelming odds. He tried to reunite Alexander's empire at the age of 80 years old, and he had nearly achieved this goal many times. He also had a living legacy, his son Demetrios, who had proven himself to his father many times over. When Demetrios realized his father had perished, he retreated from the battlefield and the Battle of Ipsus ended. The Battle of Ipsus marked the official end of the Wars of the Diadochi, though the true end would come a few decades later, with the end of the first generation of dynasts. Antigonos' death was an important turning point. He had conducted some of the early Hellenistic state-building practices, like founding cities, settling Greeks, and engaging with local rulers. While some of the surviving ancient sources are hostile towards the Antigonids, many modern scholars, like Richard Billows, have shown that he was, in fact, not just power-hungry, but keen on statecraft. After his death on the battlefield, Antigonos' body was sent to Demetrios, who gave his beloved father a royal burial worthy of the Lord of Asia. Now his empire was to be divided amongst the victors. Lysimachos, who was too busy with raids and internal Odrysian revolts in his kingdom for most of the duration of the wars, now received most of Asia Minor. Seleukos took what is today's Syria and Kurdistan, while Ptolemy took Palestine. This left out a few small regions, which were nonetheless strategically important. These included Cyprus, some Aegean islands, and southern Greece. It is noteworthy that Cassander got very little in terms of spoils, because while defeated, Demetrios still had sway over the Greek polis. His brother, Pleistarchos, did receive parts of Cilicia that were under allied control. However, the Antipatrids were not left to be alone by the gadfly that was Demetrios the Besieger. The Antigonid king had fled to Ephesus, and then most likely to Cyprus, before trying to go back to Athens. Up until now, Athens had been glad to be in alliance with Demetrios, the man who had restored democracy in their city. However, Athenian support for the man was starting to wane, for after the partition of the Antigonid realm, the merchants of the city had now lost access to supplies from Asia Minor. Thus, according to Plutarch, they sent him a delegation to say he was not to be allowed back. Demetrios instead settled in Delos and began to organize once more. Having moved back to Greece and secured his control of the region once more, he began to conduct raids against Lysimachos, eventually achieving a hold over the Asia Minor coast. Demetrios became strong enough to be considered for various martial alliances that the successors would become known for. One of these alliances came from Seleukos, who now owned the heartland of his father's former possessions. Seleukos had an issue with Ptolemy's presence in Palestine and Phoenicia, so the Greek pharaoh and the Hellenic Shahanshah broke off their diplomatic relations. This was a schism that the besieger sought to exploit. The dating is unclear, but it was likely in 299 BCE that Demetrios sent his daughter Stratonike, who was named after Demetrios' own mother, to become one of the wives of Seleukos. Later, Seleukos passed Stratonike on to his son Antiochos. This political marriage signaled that Demetrios was still strong, and that Seleukos no longer saw him as a mortal enemy. Demetrios' other wife, Diadomea, had also died of illness, so his alliance with Pyrrhos was beginning to lose ground. As Seleukos began to form yet another phase of independent foreign policy, Ptolemy sought to maintain an alliance with the now closely bound Lysimachos and Cassander. Thus, the former sent two of his daughters to marry Lysimachos and his son and heir Agathocles. We must remember when discussing this that Macedonian kings practiced polygyny, the custom of marrying multiple women. So for instance, Seleukos' wife Apama could have stuck around if she was still alive, though scholars debate whether this was the case. As alliances were being brokered, Demetrios began to raid into Ptolemaic territory. Eventually, overtures began to be made for a possible marriage alliance with Ptolemy, only to be ratified a decade later. As Hellenistic alliances were prone to shift, Demetrios and Seleukos soon began not to see eye to eye, possibly because it was seen as a short-term alliance. However, the boost to the besieger was enough for him to take advantage of a major event. In 297 BCE, Cassander died of dropsy, likely because of a sustained equine lifestyle. The man known for both his cunning in ascending to the Macedonian throne and for killing the most members of Alexander's family had perished. The key to Cassander's successes had been his ability to forge alliances and survive against difficult odds, much like his rival Demetrios. Cassander had three sons, Philip IV, Antipater I, and Alexander V, all born by the last survivor of the Argead dynasty, Thessaloniki. Thessaloniki initially seems to have remained influential, but soon her sons started to bicker over who would rule. Philip ruled briefly as the eldest heir, but died soon after. Following his passing, Antipater, the middle son, began to argue with the youngest sibling, Alexander V, over the succession. In 295 BCE, Antipater murdered his mother Thessaloniki, the sister of Alexander the Great. The reason for this matricide is unclear, but Thessaloniki had been ruling as regent in the wake of her husband's death, and thus may have had influence in the court that Antipater wanted to avoid. The last of Alexander the Great's siblings was now dead. Thessaloniki had lived to see her whole family perish, but was also ambitious herself, ruling alongside Cassander. She was thus as shrewd as her husband and her siblings, and is remembered today as the namesake of the second largest city in Greece, and for the legends of her as a mermaid who still lives, seeking her brother across the seas. A civil conflict emerged in the heartland of Macedon between the two princes, and Alexander V decided to do something rather unexpected. As Antipater was betting on being allied to Lysimachos and his Thracian troops, the youngest son invited Demetrios, the man whose dynasty his family had fought against, to come to Macedon and assist him. Demetrios was more than happy to oblige and enter this conflict by beginning a march to Macedon. However, he was not just doing this to help Alexander, but to ensure he himself would rule. In 294 BCE, in the city of Larissa, Demetrios proclaimed himself king in front of his troops. He had the legitimacy to do this through his first wife, the Macedonian daughter of Antipater, Phila, mother of both Stratonike, the wife of Seleukos, and the heir to Demetrios, Antigonos II Gonatas. He moved to Pella, took the region with relative ease, and then proceeded to murder Alexander V. Following this, Antipater I fled to Thrace and into the arms of Lysimachos, where he would be murdered years later. As all of the Diadochi were in general peace at the time, and as the Macedonians had grown dissatisfied with the bickering Antipatrids, they all accepted the kingship of Demetrios. This was to be the first of the Antigonid kings to rule over Macedon for a century. But Demetrios was not ready to stop there. He immediately began preparations to march down south once again, and, like the lightning bolt of Zeus, strike at the polys of Hellas that had dared to defy him. The death of Antigonos spelled the end of the Antigonid Empire in Asia Minor, which was now divided between Lysimachos, Ptolemy and Seleukos. Cassander was secure in his position in Macedon until his death. The Fourth War of the Diadochi had ended with the defeat of one of the most powerful armies in both Europe and Asia. However, there are still a few loose ends to tie up. One of them is Demetrios, who was still at large and would not give up on his dynastic dreams. The other will be rather unexpected, but will revolve around the phantom of the successors, Lysimachos. This successor will find himself in an unexpected situation, as his neighbourhoods, Asia Minor and Macedon, will become more unstable as the century turns. This turmoil will bring him into contact with Epirot kings like Pyrrhos, and will have him face off against Seleukos, who now wished to become the new Antigonos. Our last episode will deal with these events, which stem from the aftermath of the Fourth War of the Diadochi, and the fates of all of the surviving successors. This will be an ending of unexpected twists and turns, and will lead to some of the greatest plot twists in the history of antiquity. To make sure you don't miss it, please consider subscribing, liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would not be possible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.